Hey kids! Today's Bible story is filled with problems. So many problems, I'm not even sure I can count them all. Obviously, the Israelites had a huge problem. They were slaves in Egypt. But God protected the Israelites and caused a bunch of problems for the Egyptians. Problems like frogs and bugs and dead animals. Ew. But the Israelites didn't have any of those problems, just the Egyptians. Let's hear about it. This story comes from Exodus chapter 7 and verse 14 through chapter 10 and verse 20. Evil Pharaoh was holding the Israelites as slaves, but God had a plan to help his people. In the morning, Moses and Aaron met Pharaoh down at the banks of the Nile River. Moses shouted to Pharaoh, "You have refused to let God's people go. Now he will show you that he is the Lord." With that, Aaron raised his staff in the air and struck the water of the Nile. Suddenly, the whole river turned to blood. All of the fish in the Nile died, and the water was so gross that the Egyptians couldn't drink it. But God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he refused to let God's people go. Aaron raised his staff over the rivers and pond of Egypt. As he did this, God made frogs leap out of the water. Not just a few frogs, but enough frogs to cover the whole land. When he finally agreed to let the Israelites go, all of the frogs instantly died. But God made Pharaoh's heart hard, and he refused to let God's people go. So Aaron struck the ground with his staff, and God made the dust turn into gnats, which are tiny little flying bugs. They covered everything, but Pharaoh still refused to give in. So God sent millions of flies. Pharaoh couldn't take it anymore. He agreed to let God's people go and begged God to remove all the bugs. But when God removed the gnats and flies from the land, God made Pharaoh's heart hard, and Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. God sent another plague that killed all the Egyptians' livestock. Their horses, donkeys, camels, cows, sheep, and goats all fell down dead from disease. But still, Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. Then God made the Egyptian skin break out in painful sores called boils. But still, Pharaoh refused to listen. So Moses lifted his staff toward the sky, and God made it erupt with lightning, then thunder and hail. The Egyptians had never seen such a terrible storm. Just like before, Pharaoh gave in and told the Israelites they could leave. But when God brought an end to the storm, God made Pharaoh's heart hard, and Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. God made the wind blow through Egypt all day and into the night. When morning came, the wind had brought in a swarm of locusts, which are a lot like grasshoppers. The locusts covered the ground like a thick blanket and ate every plant and crop that had survived the hailstorm. But again, God made Pharaoh's heart hard, and Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. God made a deep darkness come over the land of Egypt. For 3 days, there was no light in Egypt except for where the Israelites lived. Finally, Pharaoh called to Moses and said, You and your people can go, but your livestock must stay." Moses refused to accept Pharaoh's terms. "No," Moses said, "our animals must go with us." This made Pharaoh so mad that he screamed, "Then no one is leaving, and if I see your face again, you will surely die." God wasn't done working yet. God would protect his people from the evil Pharaoh. They just had to wait a little while longer and trust God. What a cliffhanger! I can't wait until next week's story. This story shows God's power. He is omnipotent. That means all powerful. God can do anything. Turn water into blood? No problem. Cause millions of frogs to cover all of Egypt except for where the Israelites lived? Sure thing. Causing 3 days of darkness to cover all the land where the Egyptians live? Not even hard. Jeremiah 32:17 says, "Ah, Lord God, behold, you have made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. There is nothing too hard for you." Jeremiah 32:17. Nothing is too hard for God. This is the same God who put the stars in the sky and put every hair on your head. The same God who commands the winds to blow and the rain to fall. There is no ends to his strength. He is even strong enough to raise the dead. He brought Jesus back to life after 3 days of being dead. That's powerful. If he is strong enough to help Joseph go from a slave and prisoner to second in command of Egypt, if he is powerful enough to protect his people in Egypt and eventually set them free, if he is able to raise Jesus from the dead, then he is strong enough to help you with your problems. Our biggest problems are easy for God. He wants to help us. As he heard the cries and prayers of his people in Egypt, he will hear you too.